I never imagined the day would come when two sheriff's deputies would be standing on the porch of our secluded mountain cabin, hands hovering near their holsters, ordering my wife to step outside with her hands visible. Their boots creaked against the old pine planks of our wraparound porch as they delivered the shocking news. They were responding to a report of criminal trespassing and breaking and entering. And behind them, wearing a smug grin that could curdle milk, stood Susan Gallagher, her blazer glittering with HOA president pins like a badge of self-appointed royalty. Susan was the most power-hungry woman in all of Silver Lake County, and she'd finally brought her chaos to our doorstep. Officers, my wife Emily said evenly, though I could see the faint tremor in her hands. There must be some kind of mistake. This is our property. Susan stepped forward, her voice syrupy and full of mock concern. These people have been squatting here for weeks, she declared. As president of the Silver Lake Estates HOA, I have full documentation showing this cabin falls under our jurisdiction. They failed to file any occupancy paperwork, and they haven't paid a single association fee. The taller deputy, a man with graying temples and the kind of calm authority that comes from decades on the job, turned towards Emily. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see proof of ownership. Mrs. Gallagher here stated you broke into this property earlier today." Without hesitation, Emily reached into her back pocket and pulled out a folded document. "Here's a certified copy of the deed, officer," she said. "As you'll see, this property was transferred to me 3 months ago when my Uncle Arthur passed away. My name is right there, Emily Lawson, sole owner." I watched Susan's expression crumble in real time. The smug confidence drained from her face like water down a sink. First confusion, then disbelief, then a hint of panic. The deputy scanned the deed carefully before turning to Susan with thinly veiled irritation. "Mrs. Gallagher, this clearly lists Mrs. Lawson as the legal owner. Care to explain why you called 911 to report her for trespassing on her own property?" Susan's mouth opened and closed like a stunned goldfish. "There must be. The HOA records show," she stammered, but her words tripped over themselves and fell flat. But the truth was, this was just the beginning of Susan Gallagher's spectacular downfall. 3 months earlier, Emily and I had been sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Denver, still trying to process the news. Her Uncle Arthur, a lifelong forest ranger and the most self-reliant man I'd ever known, had passed away and left Emily his most treasured possession, a beautiful log cabin nestled on 5 acres of untouched Colorado wilderness. Ted Lake access, sweeping mountain views, and the kind of quiet that city folks spend their whole lives chasing. "The property is free and clear," the attorney said, sliding a stack of papers across his polished mahogany desk. "No liens, no mortgages, and according to county records, the land predates any homeowners association in the area." That weekend, we loaded up our truck with supplies and drove up into the mountains, hearts pounding with excitement. Now, the cabin was everything we dreamed of, rustic yet well-maintained, with a grand stone fireplace dominating the living room and wide windows framing the Rockies like living artwork. We spent that first day exploring, marking spots for a vegetable garden and talking about adding a deck extension. That's when we noticed the signs, small metal placards nailed to trees and fence posts, reading, "Silver Lake Estates, HOA, Community Standards Enforced." Emily frowned. Uncle Arthur never said anything about an HOA. I shrugged it off, probably just for the new houses down the hill. "This place has been in your family since the 60s. How wrong I was." Our first encounter with Susan Gallagher came exactly 1 week later. Emily and I were hauling out old lumber from a collapsed shed when a white Lexus SUV purred up our gravel driveway, spotless despite the dirt roads. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s, her blonde hair lacquered into a helmet that could probably survive a hurricane. "Excuse me?" she called out, her tone brisk and commanding. "I don't believe we've met." "I'm Susan Gallagher, president of the Silver Lake Estates HOA. I straightened and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you. I'm David Lawson, and this is my wife, Emily. We just inherited this place from her uncle." Susan's sharp eyes flicked between us before she pulled out an iPad and started scrolling with manicured nails. "Lawson, I don't see any transfer paperwork filed with the HOA. You do know that all property transfers must be approved by the board, right?" Emily stepped forward with that determined look in her eyes that always meant trouble for whoever stood in her way. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gallagher, this cabin belonged to my Uncle Arthur for over 40 years. It's private property." Susan laughed, a sound halfway between a scoff and a screech. "Honey, that's what they all say. Every property within 5 miles of Silver Lake falls under our jurisdiction, and I already see several violations. That lumber piles an eyesore and needs to go. Your grass is over the height limit, and is that a bird feeder? Those attract rodents, strictly prohibited." She tapped furiously on her iPad. "I'll send you the new resident packet, but you'll need to attend next month's board meeting for occupancy approval. There's a $5,000 transfer fee, and your annual dues of $3,000 are already past due." Before we could even respond, she turned on her heel, climbed back into her Lexus, and sped off, leaving behind a trail of dust and disbelief. The next few weeks turned into a nightmare. Susan showed up constantly, clipboard in hand, documenting violations. Our firewood wasn't stacked to HOA specifications. The American flag on our porch was the wrong size. Even our old pickup truck was, in her words, bringing down property values. This is harassment. Emily fumed one evening after Susan spent 20 minutes lecturing us about an unapproved mailbox. Uncle Arthur never dealt with any of this nonsense. That night, I decided to dig deeper. With my laptop open and a pot of coffee brewing, I started tracing the HOA's history. And what I found was shocking. The Silver Lake Estates HOA had only been formed 8 years ago to manage a cluster of luxury homes on the south shore of the lake. Our cabin, however, sat on the north shore, on land that had existed since the 1950s, zoned rural residential and never included in any planned community. "Look at this," I told Emily, showing her the county zoning maps. "Our property isn't part of their HOA at all." Her eyes brightened. "So she has no authority over us, none whatsoever." The next time Susan came around, we were ready. She marched up the driveway with a stack of papers and a face full of righteous fury. "I've been more than patient," she announced. "Here are your citations, $3,000 in fines for multiple violations. You're scheduled for a disciplinary hearing next Tuesday." I didn't take the papers. "Mrs. Gallagher, we've looked into this. Our property isn't under your HOA's jurisdiction." Her face went beet red. "That's where you're wrong. I've been president for 6 years. I know exactly where our boundaries are. Your uncle might have gotten away with ignoring the rules, but you won't." Emily crossed her arms. Then show us the official HOA maps that include our property." Susan's lips tightened. "Only board members can view them. Then we'll request them from the county," I said calmly. "In the meantime, please stop coming here uninvited. You're trespassing." Susan gave a bitter little laugh. "Trespassing. I'm conducting official HOA business, but fine, have it your way. Don't come crying to me when the sheriff gets involved." She stomped back to her SUV, snapping photos of our property as she left. And I had a sinking feeling she meant every word. 3 weeks later, things came to a head. I had to drive back to Denver for a meeting, leaving Emily at the cabin to finish painting the kitchen cabinets. Around 2 p.m., my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen, but instead of her voice, I heard the crackle of police radios. "David," she said, her voice steady but tight, "you need to come back." Susan called the cops and told them I broke into the cabin. My knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as I merged onto the highway, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and fury. This was war. "Are you okay? What happened?" I asked the moment I picked up the phone. "I'm fine," Emily replied, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. The deputies are here now. I showed them the deed, but David, she told them I was a dangerous squatter. They had their hands on their weapons when they approached me. The drive back to the cabin felt like the longest 90 minutes of my life. My pulse hammered with every mile until, finally, I turned up our gravel road. 2 sheriff's cruisers sat in the driveway, lights still flashing. And right beside them, Susan's white Lexus gleamed like a snake in the sun. Emily was on the porch, papers clutched in her hand as she spoke with the deputies. Susan stood off to the side, arms crossed and foot tapping with impatient arrogance. "Officer," I said, as I stepped out of my truck, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rage boiling in my chest. "I'm David Lawson, Emily's husband. Can someone please tell me what's going on here?" The lead deputy, a tall man with graying hair and exhaustion etched into his face, introduced himself as Deputy Miller. "Mr. Lawson," he began, "Mrs. Gallagher here called 911 reporting that your wife had broken into this cabin. She claimed to have documentation proving the property is under her HOA's control and that you were trespassing." I turned toward Susan, whose chin tilted upward in defiance. Deputy Miller continued, his tone firm. "However, your wife has provided clear proof of ownership. The deed lists her as the sole owner, properly filed with the county 3 months ago." "This is ridiculous," Susan exploded, her voice shrill. "They haven't paid HOA fees, haven't attended meetings. They're in total violation of ma'am." The deputy interrupted sharply, his patience clearly evaporating. "Whether or not they are part of your HOA is a civil matter, but making a false 911 call, claiming a crime in progress, is a criminal offense. That's a misuse of emergency services." Susan's face drained of color. "I genuinely believed the HOA records show." "Show what exactly?" Emily cut in, her tone cold and razor sharp. "That you've been harassing homeowners who aren't even part of your association? That you've been trespassing on our property for weeks?" "Let's all take a breath," Deputy Miller said, raising a hand. "Mrs. Gallagher, I strongly suggest you verify your HOA boundaries before making any more complaints. Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, if this continues, you can file a harassment report with our office." As the deputies wrapped up and prepared to leave, Miller pulled me aside. His voice dropped low. "Between you and me," he said quietly, "this isn't the first time we've had problems with Mrs. Gallagher and her HOA. You might want to talk to your neighbors." That evening, Emily and I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The adrenaline from the day finally wore off, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion and quiet fury. "We can't let this go," Emily said firmly. "She could have gotten me shot. What if I hadn't had the deed on me?" I nodded. "First thing tomorrow, we're setting up security cameras, and we need a lawyer," Emily added. "Someone who knows property law and HOA disputes." Over the next week, we turned our fear into determination. 8 high-resolution cameras went up, covering every inch of our land. Then we started knocking on doors. That's when the stories started pouring out. Mark and Linda Higgins, who lived half a mile down the road, told us she fined us $3,000 for having the wrong color shutters. "We've been here since 1995, long before her HOA even existed." Then there was Daniel Vance, a third-generation cabin owner near the lake. He showed us a pile of bogus citations. "She keeps claiming my land's part of the HOA, but county records say otherwise. She just won't stop." The biggest breakthrough came from Martha Sterling, an 80-year-old widow who had once worked in the county planning department. She invited us in for tea, then spread a collection of old maps across her kitchen table. "I remember when that HOA was formed," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Its boundaries only ever covered the new development on the South Shore. Everything else was grandfathered in as rural residential." Then she leaned in conspiratorially. "But I've heard rumors that the maps the HOA keeps on file aren't the same ones the county approved, might be worth looking into." Armed with that information, we met with our new attorney, Evelyn Ross, a sharp-minded woman in her 40s who specialized in property and HOA law. She listened to our story carefully, occasionally scribbling notes with deliberate precision. False 911 calls, trespassing, harassment, possibly fraudulent records, she summarized. If what you're describing checks out, Mrs. Gallagher could be facing both civil and criminal charges. What do we do first? I asked. Evelyn's smile was confident and razor-edged. We start with a formal complaint to the county, focusing on the boundary discrepancies. Then we request every official document related to your property, both from the HOA and the county. If fraud exists, we'll uncover it. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called with barely contained excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I compared the HOA's internal maps with the county's official records, and they don't match. Someone altered them to include 40 additional properties that were never part of the original HOA. Someone being Susan," Emily asked. "Precisely," Evelyn confirmed. "The changes were made 2 years after she became president. She's been collecting illegal dues and issuing fines to people who don't even belong to her association. That's not just fraud, that's racketeering." We filed a formal complaint the next morning. But what followed was a whirlwind. County investigators interviewed dozens of homeowners, reviewed years of financial records, and compared multiple versions of HOA maps. And as the investigation closed in, Susan's behavior turned frantic. She sent us threatening letters signed by the HOA's attorney, who, as we later discovered, was her brother-in-law. She called emergency board meetings just to rant about the loss and problem. She even tried convincing the local paper that dangerous outsiders were undermining community values, but none of it worked. Investigators found proof that Susan herself had altered digital boundary maps, expanding the HOA's reach illegally and pocketing more than $200,000 in unauthorized dues and fines. Over 6 years, the County Board of Supervisors called an emergency public hearing. The room was packed, dozens of furious homeowners clutching stacks of fake fines, bogus violation letters, and photos of citations Susan had posted on their doors. Susan sat at the defendant's table, her once perfect poise replaced by visible cracks. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair limp, her confident smile gone. The board's chairwoman spoke bluntly. "Mrs. Gallagher, the evidence shows a clear and deliberate pattern of fraud and abuse of authority. Effective immediately, the Silver Lake Estates HOA is ordered to cease all actions concerning properties outside its original boundaries. Furthermore, all fines and dues collected from these properties are to be refunded, with interest." Susan gaped, her voice rising. "You can't do this. I've spent years protecting property values. These people don't understand how hard it is to run a community." The chairwoman's tone turned icy. "You extorted money from dozens of families under false pretenses. You're lucky if fraud is the only charge you face." The crowd erupted in applause as deputies approached and escorted Susan out. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, the charges became official. 37 counts of fraud, 1 count of racketeering, and multiple counts of falsifying public documents. Emily and I were sitting on our porch one quiet evening when our neighbor, Mark, texted, "Turn on Channel 9, you're going to want to see this." The news anchor stood outside the courthouse, her hair whipping in the mountain wind. "In a stunning development," she reported, "former HOA President Susan Gallagher has been found guilty on all charges. She's been sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay $450,000 in restitution to affected homeowners." The camera cut to Susan being led away in handcuffs, her perfect image shattered, makeup streaked, expression vacant with disbelief. "I'm innocent," she shouted to the reporters. "Without me, property values will collapse. The community will fall apart." But no one listened. Her reign was over, undone not by rebellion or scandal, but by the simple act of ordinary people saying enough. As the segment ended, the last shot showed Susan stumbling on the courthouse steps, one high heel snapping as the deputies guided her toward the waiting police car. Justice, it turned out, looked good under the Colorado sun.